So today I'm here with Mark Boyce. He's the founder of IDDI, Clue Points, and Want to Treat, and we'll discuss IDMCs and how they relate to patient safety, but also other topics, including how investors will look at your trials and how other sponsors will look at your trials if you're a small biotech and you're planning on being acquired or having a fundraising, and so on. Okay, Mark, you have been around IDMCs for many decades now. You have seen what works, what doesn't work. So I will start with a more basic question, and from there we'll move into more advanced or challenging questions. So the first question, why do we use IDMCs and what role do they play?
Well, that's, of course, the most basic questions about IDMC. Why do we need them? And in fact, 20 years ago, it wasn't so obvious that we needed IDMCs, but they have proven so useful that today it's the opposite. It's kind of the rule rather than the exception. I don't think that there are many trials, at least not many big randomized trials, that do not have an IDMC, whether they be academic trials or trials run by drug companies or any sorts of trials, industry sponsored or NIH sponsored, whatever. All trials of substantial size and duration now have an IDMC. And the reason is that experience has shown that the IDMC is really the safeguard of the trial. It protects the trial against all kinds of things that can go wrong. And the IDMC is independent. So I like to call them IDMC. Sometimes people use the word DSMB, Data Safety and Monitoring Board. I think IDMC is better because it's not just about safety first, and it has to be an independent board. So IDMC means Independent Data Monitoring Committee or board. And that is, to me, the key word is the independent. So the people on the IDMC, as you know, must be independent of the trialists, of the sponsor. They must be completely independent people who just look at the trial from the outside, so to speak, and find problems potentially in the trial or in the trial data or in the trial conduct or in any other aspect of the trial that might actually jeopardize the conduct and, more importantly, the results of the trial. So IDMCs have become an absolutely essential piece of the trial conduct and clinical development programs. And that's why we're here today, to discuss their importance and to also highlight the types of decisions but recommendations they make, and the types of actions that you can involve the IDMC in.
And what is one mistake that even sponsors with a lot of experience, they usually get wrong about IDMCs?
That's a good question. That's a complicated question, to be honest, to answer. I'll just perhaps reflect on an example that I lived through, which may show the type of problem, IDMC can avoid. This was a company that came to IDDI years ago, and they showed us data from a completed randomized phase 2 trial. That trial did not have an IDMC, and that's the reason I mention it, but it was a fairly large trial. Not very large because it wasn't a phase 3, but for a phase 2 trial, pretty substantially large. There was a huge problem in this trial, whereby, in fact, the CRO that conducted the trial, this trial was conducted in Eastern Europe, and the CRO that conducted the trial had instructed the investigators that if patients didn't do well in the control arm, which was actually an open label trial, so the investigators knew if patients were on treatment or control. And so the investigators were told by the CRO that if patients didn't do well on the control arm, they had to remove them from the trial and switch them to some other treatment, which, of course, it's a ridiculous mistake. It's one of the sort of Stats 101 mistake that we should never, ever do, is to switch patients to another treatment if they don't do well. Of course, that can be done, but it has to be done according to a certain protocol, and it has consequences. In this case, the consequence was that the trial was biased, and it showed absolutely no drug effect simply because the patients that didn't do well in the control group were removed from the trial. So there wasn't an opportunity to keep these patients in the analysis where they should have been included. Now, had that trial had an IDMC, the IDMC would probably have seen this. They would have seen an imbalance between the two randomized groups with respect to the duration of follow-up. And I will come back to this notion perhaps later, because it's very important that the IDMC should not focus only on safety. Review of safety is their mission number one. And that's why IDMCs were created in the first place, was to protect the interests of the patients in the trial, such that the patients should not be submitted to undue toxicity. And in a randomized trial, of course, the sponsor doesn't know if the patient receives treatment or control, and therefore the assessment of safety, of toxicities, is more complicated than when you know exactly what treatment the patient has received. That was the reason that IDMCs were created. And back then, as I said, the IDMCs were called DSMBs. They were mostly focused on safety. But again, experience has shown us that typically an IDMC's role will go beyond a simple review of safety. They will typically also look at aspects of the conduct of a trial, more than safety, efficacy outcomes will be looked at in some cases, if that's pre-planned, if it's according to a well-defined statistical analysis plan. The IDMC will look at the efficacy analysis, but even if a formal efficacy analysis is not planned, typically the IDMC will want to look at the number of events. In other words, a sort of rough measure of efficacy, not a formal interim analysis, but a rough measure. Let me take an example. In cancer trials, we always look at the number of deaths by treatment. Well, that's both efficacy, but it's also safety, isn't it? Because if the patients die more in one treatment arm than the other, that's a problem. Whether it's due to a toxicity of the new drug or the lack of efficacy of the control, these are two different reasons why there might be an imbalance. But obviously, if you do get that imbalance, the trial, you should really seriously consider stopping the trial if that imbalance becomes too large. And so that's the role of the IDMC, it's to go beyond just safety. And again, I think one mistake that some sponsors may do, and I'm not saying that many do actually, but that's a potential mistake, is to say, well, we will just have an IDMC for the safety review and we don't care what these guys do, We have to have one, so let's just put an IDMC in place and they will do their own job, as expected. That, in my view, is a mistake. I think the IDMC should be empowered to be a partner of the sponsor in actually monitoring the trial from their point of view, which is, again, an independent point of view, and they will focus on things that matter both for the patients in the trial, but also for the trial results. In other words, for patients after the trial. Are the results of the trial going to be convincing, unbiased, reliable, approvable by the agency, and so on? So that's the role of the IDMC, is to be a very close partner of the sponsor rather than just another committee that meets from time to time.
So when we think about IDMCs, what is a kind of mistake that costs sponsors the most, either in terms of time, money, or credibility, for example?
I mean, what costs the most to sponsors is things that happen in a clinical trial that are not supposed to happen. So it's hard to answer your question, but I would say what costs the most is the unexpected, right? I mean, people plan trials and they write a protocol, they write a statistical analysis plan, they write all these charters for the committees and so on. I mean, so it's all well pre-specified. And then you run the trial, and more often than not, something happens, shit happens, as they say in the US. Something happens and you haven't planned for it, and so you are completely lost. What should we do? Again, I think this is where the IDMC is so useful, because the sponsor will be in panic mode, right? If something happens that was not expected, typically the sponsor will freak out. They would say, oh, bloody hell, I mean, we're going to lose so much, or we're going to jeopardize the trial, or we can't go to FDA with this, and so on and so forth. This is where the IDMC, being independent and being composed of wise people, wise men and wise women who have been around for long enough, the IDMC will probably advise the sponsor and say, look, given the circumstances, this is what you should be doing. Sometimes mistakes are irretrievable. Are impossible to correct. And then, unfortunately, the trial goes down the drain. But in many, many cases, these mistakes that look to be so terrible, they can be fixed in some sense. And so the IDMC, in that case, will be extremely useful, because they will provide independent advice as to how an unexpected event can be corrected by a proper action. Now, so the IDMC, in my view, again, as I said before, should be a partner to the sponsor and should really be Now, the one problem that I see is that because the IDMC is unblinded, they see all the data by treatment group, right? So they know which treatment each patient received, and they can see the comparison between the treatment arms. That's their role, is to try and make sure that, if there is any imbalance between the treatments, it doesn't become an ethical issue in terms of safety or efficacy. So the IDMC is unblinded. That means they cannot tell the sponsor, oh boy, we have a problem here, if they see that something's going wrong. I'll give you an example. Years ago, I was on a very promising a trial of a very promising drug in pancreatic cancer. As you know, pancreatic cancer is a devastating cancer. It's not easy to treat. Many trials have been conducted with new drugs for pancreatic cancer, and almost all of them have failed. Not all of them, but the majority of these trials unfortunately failed. And I was on an IDMC, again, of a very promising drug, so everyone was very excited that this drug might make a difference. So the trial had been designed with progression-free survival as the primary endpoint, right? And then the company, midway into the trial, they talked to some people, some key opinion leaders and so on, and they decided to change the endpoint to overall survival, which could be a good decision, depending on the situation. Sometimes OS is better than PFS, sometimes it's the other way around. But in any case, what this change in this protocol design implied was the duration of the trial would be longer, because you have to wait, for all patients to die, or for more patients to die before you can do the analysis of survival, OS, as compared to the analysis of progression-free survival, PFS. So the company told the IDMC, look, we've decided to change our primary endpoint. The problem is that the IDMC, we had seen the data from day one, and we knew, looking at the PFS, that there was no way the trial would be a positive trial. There was no way the trial would be a positive trial. But there had been no pre-planned interim analysis, and the IDMC could not tell the sponsor, they could absolutely not tell the sponsor, look, please don't change your primary endpoint because the trial is going to fail. So better fail early than late. We couldn't do that. And so for 2 years, the three members of the IDMC, I was the voting statistician in that IDMC, and there were 2 clinicians. We had to sit and review the data from this trial, and every time we said, we have to wait 2 more years. And it was really a problem because it didn't harm the patients. The patients had already been treated. The trial was in follow-up. So it was a question of just waiting for the analysis. So there was no harm for the patients to change the endpoint. If there had been harm to the patients, we would have told the sponsor. We would have said, look, it's unethical, you can't do that. So, but here it was just a question of when would the primary analysis take place? And it was about 2 years later because of the change in primary endpoint as compared with the initial plan. This was an excruciatingly difficult situation because the IDMC, we were really at a loss as to what to do. And eventually we decided not to tell the sponsor. But that means that company invested 2 more years of follow-up, and we knew that it wouldn't lead anywhere. We had to do it this way because one of the problems that I've seen in trials is that they can be stopped sometimes too early. The IDMC overreacts. They tell the sponsor, stop the trial. And that's, there is the thing with trial is that it's an N of 1. You have 1 opportunity to do a trial. You won't have 10 or even 2. It's 1 opportunity. If you miss that one, it's done. And so that's why I think, an IDMC should be should consist of people who have enough experience to not overreact and not take a decision that would, look to be the best decision at that time, but without taking into account all the other consequences of that decision. And so you really need to have very experienced people, very experienced clinicians and statisticians, so that they will think about not just the data that they look at today, but also what these data might look later, and more importantly, what their decisions will imply in terms of consequences. And so this is a kind of it's a bit of a sad experience because the drug didn't work, unfortunately, and that, of course, was not pleasant. But we felt that we had to let the trial run its course to have a reliable survival analysis. Supposing we would have told the sponsor, look, pull the plug, the drug isn't working, there is no signal on PFS, and at the moment we don't see a survival difference. Some people would have said, or might have said, why didn't you wait until the final analysis of OS? Who knows? That drug might have had a delayed effect, whatever. So, I mean, the very purpose of a clinical trial is to generate very reliable evidence, evidence that will be changing the practice. And if you want to have reliable evidence, you have to wait long enough to have a good analysis of the trial. So that's why we decided to keep silent, even though it was painful, but we kept silent for 2 years. And then I still remember the last IDMC meeting, the whole company was there, and they wasn't expecting, us to say, look, guys, you have a drug. Unfortunately, we had to tell them, look, I mean, there's no signal here at all. And the company actually went under because that was their single drug. But it's an interesting story that I think shows that, again, unexpected things can happen. And in my view, the change in primary endpoint wasn't really a smart idea. I mean, this was the first trial of this drug. Going for a very hard endpoint like OS, it was very courageous on their part. But I think it probably was a mistake. It cost them dearly to do that.
So now, if I'm a small biotech company, I'm starting, I have a small team, I'm low in resources, and everything I have, I'm putting on this one trial. Everything I have, one trial. Why should I think about having an IDMC, and how can it help me to go to the market faster or better? What benefits can I get from there?
You know what? I mean, at IDDI, as you know, Facundo, we have a lot of clients who are essentially biotech companies. Some of them are very small, like 2 or 3 people, developing the clinical program for a new drug, or sometimes they are bigger, but many biotechs. And the number one problem for these small companies is that usually their investors are scrutinizing them very closely, right? I mean, they are under the radar of the investors all the time. So whatever they do, they have to report to the investor or to the board. And the problem that creates is that oftentimes the investors or the board want to see more about the clinical trial than they are allowed to see. And so in that particular case, I think the IDMC's role is to protect the company, to tell them, look, don't look at the data, because if you look at the data, the FDA or the EMA or the PMDA in Japan, whatever agency in the world, that in China, it's the same. I mean, it's the same worldwide. Agencies will not allow you to look at the data of an ongoing trial, at least not if it's a properly blinded trial, etc. But even in an open label trial, actually, it's good practice to pretend it's blinded and to not look at the data. You have to look at the safety, obviously, and stuff like that. But don't look at the comparison between the treatment arms, because if you do that, then you potentially create operational bias in the trial. And that's a no-go for the agencies. The agencies see that because you've looked at the trial, you've taken some actions that create bias in the trial, you're dead. I mean, you're just dead. So the trial isn't going to succeed. And that's something that, of course, is very hard to resist, the pressure from investors who say, well, you want to do an interim analysis and the IDMC will look at the results. Why can't we take a peek at the data? Don't show us everything, but just give us some indications. And unfortunately, we can't do that. The IDMCs cannot do that and should never do that. We've tried millions of different ways of trying to go in that direction. To be honest, I'm getting tired of these things. It just doesn't work. Why does it not work? Because it's not proper conduct. If you say that you don't look, you don't look, right? I mean, you stick to what you say. You say what you do and you do what you say. So you don't look at the data, the IDMC looks at the data. So the best case scenario is if you have an IDMC as a small biotech, and the IDMC tells you, the IDMC has reviewed the data, and they say, well, the data do not suggest futility. Well, that means that the trial can continue. That should be good enough for the investors. We can define a futility boundary whereby if the drug is completely inefficacious or even worse, sometimes harmful, then I think it's a good idea to have a futility stopping rule, and the IDMC will tell the sponsor, we've crossed the futility boundary. You can continue the trial if you wish, but it's unlikely to result in a positive trial. So that's as much as the IDMC can tell the sponsor if a futility boundary was defined or if a futility analysis was predefined. If nothing was predefined, then all the IDMC can do is to review the data and tell the sponsor, you don't have to stop the trial for safety, so just keep going. But I think this futility boundary is a nice mechanism to have in a trial to kind of please the investors in a sense, in a very broad sense, by telling the investors, look, we've looked at the data and it's not as bad as to stop the trial. Doesn't mean to say it's good, huh? But it's not too bad. So if it's too bad, then you pull the plug. But if it's promising, or call it whatever you like, or not devastatingly bad, whatever, then you continue the trial. I think investors should understand that that's as much as they can get from an IDMC, not more than that. And people have been very inventive. Small biotechs, they've come up with all kinds of schemes. Just the CEO could take a peek at the data, or just someone who didn't have anything to do with the trial, a board member who's not involved in the trial conduct. I mean, everything's been tried under the sun. Everything under the sun has been tried. Nothing works. I mean, let's cut it and not even discuss it. It's not proper to do this. We shouldn't do it. And in my view, we should be very smart about defining stopping rules so that the IDMC acts in a manner that is consistent with the sponsor's interest. The IDMC does everything in the sponsor's interest and the patient's, of course. And I don't see any reason why the sponsor's interest should be different from the patient's interest. Because if the sponsor is not aligned on the patient interest, there's something really, really wrong about either the sponsor or the drug they develop, right? I mean, it should be in the best interest of the patient always. And if that's not the case, then you have a problem. So in my view, the IDMC protects ultimately the patients. And because that's their mission, they must also protect the sponsor. Because if the sponsor has a problem, then the trial will not be done. And that's not in the best interest of the patients either. So I think we live in this ecosystem where if we keep the final goal in mind, which is how can we improve the treatment of patients, in a sense, that will be good for everyone in that ecosystem. I don't think that there are diverging interests. For example, oftentimes people say the sponsors and the regulatory agencies have opposite interests, and that's not true. The sponsor wants to make money. The FDA wants to protect patients. These are completely conflicting. No, they're not conflicting. I think a very good drug will bring in a lot of money, and that's in the interest of the patients because it's a very good drug. To me, that looks like an alignment. If there was a bad drug approved, that wouldn't be in the best interest, and there you would run into a problem. So I think if we keep the patients, in mind, we can't go wrong. I mean, that's the role of the IDMC eventually, and then we have to make sure that we look at every possible way of meeting the best interest of the patients. And by the way, that reminds me that I wanted to say something that patients have not been involved in IDMCs up until today. I mean, in some they have, but in the very small minority, in all the IDMCs I've been part of, only 2 of them had a patient representative on them. And these were 2 very large trials in breast cancer. So we had a breast cancer, representative and a patient advocate, a woman who had breast cancer herself, and she was just amazing. She helped the IDMC so much. I mean, she was so inquisitive. She asked the right questions, because she knew what she was talking about. When the toxicities were discussed, clinicians tend to have their view of toxicity, right? Some toxicities they don't really care very much about. That's where the patient advocates say, wait a minute, you think that a bigger, frequency of diarrhea is no big deal. Not for you, but for the patient, who can't go to work because they are on the toilet all day long. That's not something that we want. So, I mean, you have to, change the way you look at diarrhea. It may not be a devastatingly bad toxicity for clinicians. It can be treated. It's not, life-threatening in many cases. So why bother about it? Well, why bother? Because it doesn't matter to patients quite a bit. Anyway, so that's the kind of thing we need to make sure of, is that patient advocates be represented on most IDMCs, perhaps not all of them. Some IDMCs are very technical, especially in randomized phase 2 trials. So in that case, perhaps the patient advocacy groups are not so interested. But for the large phase 3 trials, which may be practice changing, it's really a good idea to include. And that goes along with the recent recommendations of both the FDA and the EMA that patients should be involved in drug development far more in the future than they have been so far. So I would think that one of the changes that need to take place is that patient advocacy groups or patient advocates in general should be represented on IDMCs.
So now we spoke about biotech companies. Now we move into large pharma companies. So imagine I'm a large pharma company. I have big teams. I have a lot of resources. I have a lot of trials I'm running. So everything is taking place, right? So even if one trial fails, we will feel it, the patients will feel it, but we can still move forward. We have enough resources to continue moving forward, right? So strategically, when I'm planning my next moves, why should I think about an IDMC? And it might not
Yes.
even be required depending on the type of trial that I'm running, right? So how can it make it efficient for my trial, for my company? Why should I think about an IDMC?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand your question, because if you are a big pharma, typically you will run several trials, in the same disease with the same drug, and sometimes in slightly different indications, sometimes in combinations in single agent. I mean, there are lots of possibilities, but typically a large pharma will run several trials in parallel. So I don't think that that's any argument for not having an IDMC. In fact, it might be an argument for having, in a sense, an IDMC for a program, for a development program, rather than for single trials. It wouldn't make sense, of course, if you did 10 trials, let's say, with a new drug, to have 10 different IDMCs, because all of these IDMCs would essentially have to understand the mechanism of the drug, the types of toxicities expected. So it would become more complicated, in my opinion, than if you could appoint an IDMC that looks at several trials. Of course, then the task of the IDMC becomes more complex, because they have to review data from multiple trials. But that is very often done by big pharma. And the advantage of that is that you can then optimize the decision you take in one given trial, but with knowledge of what's happening in the others. For example, I mean, it's not unusual that a certain type of toxicity might occur with a drug that wasn't expected, and that could be cardiovascular problems, could be respiratory problems in some cases. With some of the drugs recently developed in cancer, we've seen those kinds of things. What do you do? Well, if you have a very low incidence of this problem, pulmonary embolism could be a very low incidence toxicity, but if you see an imbalance and more with that new drug than with the control treatment, of course, if you have 4 versus 1 or 8 versus 3, is that significant? No, it's not significant. People would turn to me and would say, is that significant? I would say, no, it's not. So that doesn't mean to say we can ignore it. We still have to keep that in mind. But if we know that in many trials, the same trend happens, then we can begin to do a better job. We can borrow information from different trials. People have even suggested to use formal approaches for this, like Bayesian approaches, where you actually borrow information from different sources in order to make sense of the data that you analyze or that you look at for a given trial. And all of these ideas are very good, but the idea of having a program specific rather than trial specific IDMC is certainly viable and is adopted by many pharma companies.
Yeah, if I can add on that, actually, I worked on, for one company that we had multiple IDMCs, the same IDMC members, so different trials, right? And that was my first time working in this kind of scenario where the same people were reviewing everything for multiple trials, because what was interesting was exactly what you said, that they noticed one adverse event that was taking place in this trial and on that trial as well. So for the next one, they were already asking or actually checking that specific adverse event to see whether it was also happening on this trial as well. So that's extremely interesting to see how they managed to, in a way, incorporate all the information from different trials and move forward, having a better understanding on the treatment itself, on what it can do for the patients in different conditions. So, yeah, absolutely, I like it.
That is very often done. And since you mentioned, that you can combine information from several trials, and another thing that has appeared more recently with IDMCs is that oftentimes, you look at the safety data and then you look at the efficacy data in formal interim analysis. But oftentimes the question is not so much about safety and efficacy separately, but what is the benefit risk? For example, if you have multiple doses, and that didn't happen in the past very frequently because usually people would use the maximum tolerated dose of their agent, that's it, or the dose just under that, and that was it. Now, with the Optimus project that FDA has issued, the sponsors have to be much more serious about finding the optimal dose, whatever that means. Optimal dose is not easy to define, but certainly it's the dose that has the best benefit-risk ratio, in some sense. And now we have a company, IDDI has a subsidiary called One to Treat, which develops software for generalized pairwise comparison, which is a way to integrate efficacy and safety outcomes in a single analysis. Now, up until today, IDMCs typically have not, looked at data in this way. But I think personally, not always, but in some cases, this would be a very useful way to look at the data, especially at the interim analysis, to look at the benefit risk rather than just efficacy and safety separately, to try to make sense of, what is this drug really bringing to the patients in terms of the better benefit risk, especially if several doses are investigated.
So we know that IDMCs, they can see all the data, they have the unblinded data, while the sponsor will have the blinded data, right? So naturally, the IDMC has the access to critical information that could guide the sponsor on their next moves. And now my question is, what kind of early signs can the IDMC catch that the sponsor simply cannot? And what are the risks when those recommendations are delayed or just not acted on?
Well, that's a really difficult question you ask, because the IDMC is not there to run the trial. Again, they try to protect the sponsor against the unexpected and things that go wrong. But they're not there to replace the sponsor in any sort of way. So when you say signals that appear, I'm not sure what you mean. Signals that begin to emerge, well, you have to wait until these signals become significant enough that you have to take action on them. And that's what the IDMC does typically, whether this pre-specified or not. Because one of the differences between a formal analysis plan for a trial and an IDMC is that in a formal analysis plan, you pre-specify everything that you're going to test, right? And then you do the analysis according to plan. In an IDMC, that won't fly, because if you had a plan for a certain toxicity, then you would know about the toxicity, and then the role of the IDMC would become, in a sense, secondary, because you would know about the toxicity beforehand. So essentially, you have no plans for these unexpected toxicities. That's where the IDMC is really useful. So when these trends emerge, I think the difficulty is to know when to alert the sponsor that they have a problem with safety. I suppose that's the question you asked. Efficacy is even more challenging because you have to wait much longer before you see those signals, unless the drug is miraculously effective, which doesn't happen very often. But if safety is a problem, that can occur early in the trial. You can have a few events that really trigger an IDMC red flag. I think, to me, the IDMC must react to these signals. And the problem is that oftentimes they have to react using their common sense, because there are no rules, there are no formal rules. We don't have a statistical analysis plan to follow. We have to look at the data of the trial and just make sense of them. Is the toxicity, completely unexpected or not? Is it very serious in many cases, or is it a common toxicity that people can tolerate? Is it really causally linked to the treatment, or is it more due to the disease? Because sometimes toxicities and, cancer, the tumor itself, can have similar effects. Like in lung cancer, if you have, respiratory problems, that might be the tumor or the drug. These are complex issues that really need a careful review. That's why you need to have very expert people on the IDMC. But the question as to when to alert the sponsor that a safety signal has been observed, it's a good question. There is no general answer to that, other than to say, well, we will leave it to the expert, because it depends on so many parameters. You can't have a general rule. In some trials in the past, we've tried to define a stopping rule for safety. And we can do this using, for example, a Bayesian approach, or we could do sequential, look at the data, and decide to stop when a certain condition is met. The problem is that in general, you have no idea what to expect, and therefore it's very hard to predefine a rule that makes sense. So it's probably better to let the IDMC, review data in their wisdom. And that's why I said before also that when the IDMC looks at safety, oftentimes the question occurs, to say, well, we see sort of a trend that this drug seems to be more toxic than the control. But is there at least a trend towards better efficacy as well? Because if we see a safety signal beginning to build, and at the same time worse efficacy, then it may become a real issue sooner, because you can't both harm the patient, and fail to give them the better treatment, which would be the control in that case. You can't do that. So that's even a more acute ethical problem. When do we alert the sponsor that they really should pull the plug, or that they should consider? Remember, the IDMC is an advisory board. It's never taking any decision. It's never acting. It's just recommending a course of action to the sponsor. And to be honest, there have been cases where the IDMC recommended something to the sponsor and the sponsor overruled. They had good reasons to overrule. Now, if there is a safety issue, the sponsor will never overrule, of course, because they will say, okay, we acknowledge there is a safety problem. We will not continue the trial in that case. But in some cases where it's more of a subjective call, the sponsor may well say, well, thank you very much, IDMC, we've listened to what you said, but we're going to overrule. For example, the IDMC decides that the trial can be stopped, and the sponsor believes that, it won't fly from a regulatory point of view. That because suppose that a trial is stopped at 80% information time, right? And the interim analysis is significant. And you had planned to do a final analysis, which would come like 6 months later. The problem in that case is that the IDMC says, okay, you can go to the FDA, you are significant, you can get this drug approved. Now, by the time you get to the FDA, you have to do all the analysis, prepare the submission. I mean, this all takes a lot of time. That's at least 6 months. Then you go to FDA, you say, look, the interim analysis was significant, the IDMC recommended stopping. What will the FDA say? They will say, well, but now, you should have your final analysis. So why do we bother about this? Show us the final, right? So in that case, the IDMC may well recommend stopping the trial, and the sponsor will say, no, we want to continue the trial. Thank you very much for telling us. That means we can prepare our submission. We can work on it, but we continue the trial until the bitter end. And to be honest, if the IDMC is very competent, that's what they will recommend. They will recommend to the sponsor, look, you have a significant result, your drug works, you can begin your filing, but keep going with the follow-up of the patients. And that is a recommendation that an IDMC should always do, is to say, you have a significant result, but you should continue to follow up of all the patients until death. That would be the ideal scenario. I know it doesn't always happen, but this should be a recommendation of all IDMCs. It's not because your drug works today that you can pull the plug and not even know when people die. Because unfortunately, death remains a very significant event in most advanced tumors. So if we're talking about advanced disease, really patients should be followed until death. My view is that even in the adjuvant setting, if there are many years of follow-up, the sponsor should be obliged to continue follow-up until maybe the death of our patient is probably unrealistic, but for many, many years, at least a decade, because that's valuable information. And so, the IDMC, one of the risks of an IDMC is that because they've said, it's okay, your interim results are good enough, the sponsor immediately stops everything. That is sometimes possible, but not always. And many times the patients are still in follow-up, so they have to continue treating these patients until, the end of their treatment course, and they have to follow up the patients to have enough events to do a reasonably powered survival analysis. That's required by the agency. But even beyond what the agencies require, I believe that most trials would benefit from having a very long follow-up. It's not in the interest of the sponsors, but that would be interesting in the interest of the patients and in the interest of our knowledge of, of the reality of when patients die. And that would lead to a lot of interesting analysis, like long-term survival after being submitted to certain types of drug. Take immunotherapies, for example. there's a big unknown about the long-term effects of immunotherapy because you fool with the immune system, and no one knows, to be honest, what the very long-term consequences of this are going to be. So I think long-term follow-up in cancer trials really should be the norm rather than the exception.
So can you share an example where an IDMC changed the direction of a trial? And you don't have to say the name of the company involved if you don't want to. But
I can give you an example where the IDMC, in a sense, didn't follow the pre-specified rules. That can happen too. And that was a very interesting. We've actually written a book chapter with Janet Wittes and Jay Herson, the two people who've been involved in IDMCs from the very beginning. There's a number of people who've really contributed to developing the field of IDMCs. Dave Demetz at the University of Wisconsin, Susan Lennenberg, and Tom Fleming has been very influential too. So all of these people have been, thinking about what IDMCs should do. And I was lucky enough to work with Janet and Jay on this chapter where we described something that happened to an IDMC. We had been given, as always, a charter by the sponsor, and the charter had planned for 2 interim analyses for futility. This was actually pre-planned, and so the IDMC, as planned, looked at the first interim analysis, and the boundary of futility was crossed. So the IDMC was supposed to tell the sponsor, stop this trial. And the recommendation was, keep going. So not according to plan. And the reason why that was decided was that, in fact, there was a major imbalance in the patient prognosis. The prognostic distribution, between the 2 treatment groups was pretty much imbalanced and was actually against the treatment. So the trial was futile. There was absolutely no treatment effect to be seen. But first of all, this pre-planned analysis for futility was way too early. It was way too early. I mean, you don't want to stop a trial for futility before you have enough information to be relatively sure, and that wasn't the case. And plus, there was this imbalance. The imbalance was actually due also to the small number, right? In a small sample, if people don't use a proper randomization technique, they can run into an imbalance. That's why we at IDDI, we always recommend minimization, because it kind of guarantees, at least in probability, that we don't have these big imbalances between prognostic factors. But anyway, in that trial, there was that, and it disfavored the treatment. So the IDMC reasoned that might be the cause for futility. So they said to the sponsor, just keep going. And then the sponsor keeps going, and the trial continues, and the second interim analysis for futility comes up again. And again, the boundary is crossed. So, I mean, most IDMC would have said, oh, enough is enough, now we stop. And in their wisdom, the IDMC said, keep going. Why? Because that imbalance, initial imbalance, was still a bit there, but it had gone better because the sample size was now larger, and the balance had tended to become less acute than in the first interim analysis. But there was still a bit of it. But more importantly, the IDMC reasoned that, again, the sponsor had one chance to show that this drug worked. This was in a condition that is not well treated. So the standard of care is not satisfactory in this particular condition. And here is a drug that, yes, the data suggests that it's really not very promising, but is it sufficient to pull the plug and say this drug has no hope of ever showing anything? And we felt, and I was the voting statistician, and the whole IDMC felt that this was not sufficiently reliable evidence to kill the drug. Because if by chance the beginning of the trial had been just an unlucky lack of effect for the drug that could actually change over time, maybe the drug would show something. Long story short, at the end of the trial went until the end. At the end of the trial was almost significant, not quite, almost significantly in favor of the new drug, which shows that you can be really wrong early on for various reasons, but the random play of chance is the most important reason, right? If you do 2 interim analyses early on, the random play of chance, will make it relatively likely that you will see nothing, even for a very active drug. So this drug was probably not very active, but it had some activity. And so we told the sponsor, of course, at the end of the trial, we had to say, look, guys, we're sorry to confess now, but we've recommended to continue the trial twice, even though the boundary had been crossed. But we did not agree with this boundary. We thought it was not a very sensible boundary. there was an imbalance in the prognostic features of the patients, and we felt that you had to establish reliably that this drug didn't work. And the sponsor thanked us. They said, we accept the fact that we've done the trial, it costs us, but at least we now know that this drug is probably, even though there was a big trend in favor, they said, well, this is probably not a good enough drug to go to market. But they really thought that the IDMC had behaved responsibly, which is a bit paradoxical, but because we did twice, we took a decision that was exactly the opposite to what the sponsor had told us to take. So the point of this example is that I think the IDMC must always be free to act as they see fit, again, in the best interest of the patients, and therefore also in the best interest of the sponsor. And that's exactly what happened here. We believe that we did the right thing, even in retrospect, and the sponsor agreed with that. So again, I think an IDMC is a very, it should not be a completely predetermined kind of artificial intelligence that just you press the button, it gives you an answer. It needs to be done perhaps with some AI support, but it should be done by people who have enough experience to put it in a broader context and just use their brains and human reasoning to say, well, is it the best course of action to stop the trial? And more often than not, even if some boundary has been exceeded, more often than not, if you really think carefully about what you do, unless the evidence is compelling, in my view, you should lean on uncertainty and say, well, I see something that's really interesting here, but I would like to be really convinced. Because remember, it's not enough for a trial to be statistically significant. That's not enough, in my view. That's a prerequisite. But the next step is, how better is it than the control? What is the magnitude of the effect? And what is the benefit risk? If you improve the outcome of the patients, but at the cost of huge toxicities, you know that that drug is not going to fly. It's not going to be used by oncologists. So you have to look at the broader picture, and that's the role of the IDMC.
So, Mark, what makes an IDMC work well in practice?
Oh, again, not an easy question because it's multiple things, but I think perhaps the most common theme that makes an IDMC succeed, I think, is that it should focus on things that matter. Again, like we discussed before, an IDMC is not just a formality which runs, according to pre-specified rules, and, they meet every 6 months and they review the data, they give a recommendation. That seems to be a very standard process. It's all predefined. Nothing can go wrong with it. I think an IDMC in practice is more than that. As I mentioned, there may be unexpected events. And so even if everything is expected, it's surprising to me that IDMCs have become very procedural. So, you have to have a charter, you have to have minutes, you have to meet at a certain time, and this and that. So the procedure is well in place. But that's not what makes an IDMC succeed. What makes an IDMC succeed is that the focus should be on things that really matter. I'll give you an example. Recently, I was in an interim analysis of an IDMC, and this was for a big company, a big pharma company. And so now comes the time of the interim analysis. And, the charter, we all signed the charter, so all the members were happy with this. And everything goes according to plan. And then, just before the interim analysis takes place, we have a meeting with the sponsor to decide on what attitude we should, have. And we begin to ask some questions about the interim analysis. And for example, one question we ask is, at the time of the interim, which was going to be the next week, at the time of the interim analysis, so now, how many patients are still on treatment? There was nothing in the charter about that. Nothing at all. I mean, yes, you had the stopping boundary and 2 pages of statistical derivations that, no one reads, or that people read and don't understand. So, I mean, that's a completely useless thing, but 2 pages of statistical considerations. So we knew exactly the p-value to the 15th decimal that we should actually consider to be significant. The significance level had been adjusted by a very sophisticated stopping rule and all that. So, I mean, exquisite detail about things that really don't matter. I don't care, what the 15th decimal of the significance level might be. So statisticians obsess about these details that are completely trivial. That's not what matters. What matters is something that no one had said a word in the charter is how many patients are still on treatment. Because if the IDMC finds at the interim analysis that the treatment works better than control, what do? If you announce that the treatment works better and there are still many patients on treatment, what do you do with these patients? Do you switch them over or do you keep them on that treatment? Especially patients in the control arm who now know that they are on a treatment arm that is not as good as, or even sometimes much worse than the new treatment. What do? I mean, that's what matters, right? That's again what matters to patients. Patients don't care if your significance level is 0.001 or 0.002. That's trivial. Statisticians will be completely crazy about that, but it doesn't matter. What matters is really what is important to know at the time of the decision and what actions the sponsor will take if, as they hoped, the IDMC tells them, look, the drug works better than control, the result is statistically significant, we can now consider that your treatment does work, it has efficacy. There are many other questions that follow from there, and that's, in my view, what an IDMC should focus on and should be informed about. So I was really flabbergasted that when we asked the question to the sponsor, it's as if that question had not been really considered very, as if they would think about it if the event happened. Well, that's not good enough. I think an IDMC will take decisions or will recommend courses of action that have an impact on patient management in the trial and after the trial on future patients. So that's really what the IDMC should think about. And so I believe that that's where the action is, things that matter. And forget the small details and the very complex rules of behavior. That's really not where the IDMC, I think, should spend their time. It's really on things that matter most.
And how does an IDMC or the IDMC process affect the way that the FDA or the EMA will see a trial?
Yeah, of course. I mean, IDMCs, again, are there to protect the sponsor. And I think that includes the regulatory submission. If you can submit to the agency, the notes that the IDMC took, the minutes of the meetings, if the FDA or EMA or other agencies see that the trial has been followed properly by the IDMC, they may in some cases actually go back to the minutes of the meeting to see, for example, when a safety signal began to emerge. So it's really important, I think, to have proper documentation so that the agencies can understand the course of action the sponsor took and why, at what time they decided to do something and the reasons for it. So again, I think agencies ultimately will, in the best case scenarios, approve the drug that is being investigated. So they have to have access to documents that are useful to them. And again, I would avoid, the unnecessary details. For example, again, based on my experience, the IDMC has a charter. That charter should, again, focus on what matters. And what I really, really dislike is when a sponsor changes the charter of the IDMC every other week because one personnel has changed and so they have to have an amendment of the charter. That is stupid bureaucracy that helps no one. That is absolutely useless and that people should get rid of. That is counterproductive rules. Or what matters, and the agency is not going to, mind if personnel changes or if there is a change at the sponsors, on the sponsor side. What they will want to know is when something happened, based on the data, when a data signal was observed and the action that the sponsor took. That's important. The rest, so I think the IDMC charter should be essentially a simple document that just provides guidelines for the IDMC as to how they should conduct their business, the types of report they should write and the types of data they will review and the things that they should focus on. But essentially, that can be done in a few paragraphs. It doesn't have to be a 20 pages long document. And this is something that we've seen in other areas of clinical research is that, we start from a good idea and then we build, layers and layers of administration on top and it becomes undoable. The procedural aspects take over. And again, if you go back to the founding fathers of IDMC, I mentioned Dave Demetz and Tom Fleming and Susan Ellenberg, the others. I think these people really had a vision for the IDMC that I think we should keep in mind and not make them so burdensome and complicated and procedural that people are so tired of them that they say, I don't even want to be on one of them because it's such a bloody pain. See, we need to keep it simple and focused on things that matter.
So what's your advice for sponsors setting up their first IDMC?
All right. Well, I mean, I think, first of all, there is good literature on IDMCs, by people who really founded the field of IDMCs. Dave Demetz, Tom Fleming, Susan Ellenberg, Janet Withers, Jay Herson. There are books around that people can, easily get, and these are very informative. I would just focus on essentials, for the first IDMC. The first IDMC should really focus on, of course, safety, because that's the mission number one of an IDMC, is to focus on safety. But I would already include in the IDMC charter more than safety. Look at the trial conduct, for example. I mean, an IDMC is in a unique position to look at the trial conduct, and how the trial is accruing patients, how many sites are there. Is it difficult to open sites? Are there sites that have been opened that contribute no patients? These look like mundane questions, but they actually reveal a lot about how the study is conducted and how likely it is that the study will go to the end and produce reliable results. So all of that, in my view, is part of the mission of the IDMC. And then I would also define, the type of information the IDMC is supposed to review. That's obvious. But, at IDDI, we do a lot of IDMCs. And depending on the sponsor, we get very different requests as to how we should present the information. Some sponsors, they want us to run the full analysis of the trial as if this was the final analysis of the trial and just show that to the IDMC. So in other words, it's the final analysis of the trial in terms of format, but it has only partial data because it's an interim analysis, for safety reasons. And so, that may be a problem because that generates a lot of pages. It's not uncommon. I've recently had an IDMC where one of the reports was 12,000 pages long. Why? Because that's the full set of listings and tables that the sponsor intends to submit to the agency. Now, many people say, well, this is ridiculous. I can see the rationale for this, to be honest. I think, the rationale is, well, this is what's going to be seen by the agency eventually. So why not show that information in that format to the IDMC? Problem is that it's a lot of information to digest. And so many IDSC members become crazy when they get that many pages, especially if there is no summary of it, of any sort. So just look at 12,000 pages and make sense of it. Well, you could use AI these days to do this, right? You could feed those tables in an AI tool and ask the AI tool to do the analysis for you. And, where are the signals there? That would be very dangerous because if some IDMC members go to do this on ChatGPT, then all of your data are, in the cloud somewhere. We don't want that. So I think it's far better to do, if the sponsor insists on having that very long list of tables and listings, why not? But it's important to complement this with a summary, an executive summary, which says, look, you've seen 12,000 pages. This is what we make of it. And just for someone, potentially helped by a private AI tool, to say, and I view it as a statistician doing their job, looking at all these tables and saying, oh, here I see something that really we should pay attention to, and have an executive summary for the IDMC with that information. That to me is the best way to do it, is to really provide an executive summary of what the IDMC should see. Another thing that often happens in IDMCs is that during the meeting, some of the clinicians ask questions. And of course, then the statistician who is on the IDMC must be able to answer these questions, which is sometimes very challenging because this can touch on very subtle medical details. For example, are two terms identical in meaning when you look at the verbatim description of the toxicities and then the coding of them? Sometimes you have terms that look similar. And then very logically, the IDMC says, but should we combine these terms? That's where a good statistician becomes useful because they will do this ahead of the meeting and they will not be taken by surprise if such a question comes up. So we're talking about someone pre-processing the data and preparing an executive report. Sometimes it's done, sometimes it's not done. I think it's much easier for the IDMC to have that done. That doesn't mean to say that this executive summary contains all the problems. sometimes an IDMC member can detect something that the statistician hasn't seen or found to be not particularly of interest. So that doesn't mean to say it's the end of the story, but it does help the IDMC tremendously. And then the meeting isn't spent on trying to find information. How do I do a search? For example, sometimes if you have 12,000 pages, the first thing I do is I do a search for death. And I just let the program, because these are Word documents, so I just look for death. And then I'm sure that I've looked at all the death information. But this is a very antiquated way of doing it, right? I remember in IDMC when one of the clinicians said, "How do I do this?" And then we told them, open Word, and then look at, press this button to find death. And then he did it. This is a bit ridiculous, isn't it? I mean, this should be done by an expert statistician, or sometimes even a statistician plus a clinician. So this is the type of thing that I think should be prepared for an IDMC. Again, the IDMC is not a passive body that you have to throw data to and just hope they do a good job. You really have to think of what they need to review, why, and how you can present the information to make it maximally efficient and reliable.